The music director of National Presbyterian Church thought he was hiring a talented tenor for the choir when he accepted Andrei Kashkin in 1958. He had actually just given a Soviet intelligence officer a front-row seat to America's most sensitive Cold War conversations. On a Sunday afternoon in September 1958, a well-dressed man with a slight European accent approached the music director of National Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. He expressed interest in joining the choir. His name, he said, was Andrei Kashkin. The music director, Harold Morrison, had led the church choir for 12 years. He recognized talent when he heard it. When Kashkin sang his audition piece, a classical hymn in flawless tenor, Morrison knew immediately this was a voice his choir needed. National Presbyterian Church stood on Connecticut Avenue, a massive Gothic structure that served as the spiritual home for some of Washington's most powerful citizens. Every Sunday, senators occupied the front pews. Cabinet members sat beside military generals. CIA officials brought their families to worship. The church had become more than a place of prayer. It was a social institution where the architects of American Cold War policy gathered to seek divine guidance and discuss the week's challenges over coffee in the parish hall. Morrison asked Kashkin about his background. The man explained he had fled Eastern Europe in 1953, escaping communist oppression. He had come to America seeking freedom, including the freedom to worship openly. His voice carried genuine emotion when he spoke of religious persecution behind the Iron Curtain. This narrative resonated perfectly with Morrison and the church leadership. In 1958, the Cold War had crystallized into a clear moral framework. America represented religious freedom. The Soviet Union embodied godless tyranny. A refugee from communist atheism seeking sanctuary in their choir seemed almost providential. Morrison welcomed Kashkin immediately. They needed tenors, and this man's voice was exceptional. His story of escape from Soviet control made him sympathetic. His apparent devotion made him trustworthy. What Morrison could not have known was that the man before him had spent the last 3 years training at a facility outside Moscow, designated as Institute 311. The voice was real. The training was extensive. The devotion was performance. Kashkin had been selected specifically because his tenor voice provided the perfect cover for an intelligence operation that Soviet planners had been developing since 1955. The KGB had identified American churches as critical blind spots in Western security consciousness. Religious institutions attracted powerful people. They fostered trust through shared faith. They held regular gatherings with minimal security. And most importantly, Americans would never suspect a man who sang hymns of being a Soviet intelligence officer. The audition lasted 15 minutes. Morrison offered Kashkin a position in the tenor section immediately. They shook hands. Morrison gave him a schedule of upcoming rehearsals and Sunday services. As Kashkin left the church that afternoon, walking down Connecticut Avenue toward his small apartment in Georgetown, he mentally reviewed the faces he had seen in the sanctuary during his audition. He recognized 3 of them from photographs he had studied in Moscow. The trap was fully set. The operation could begin. In the landscape of Cold War espionage, Soviet intelligence had identified an operational blind spot in American security consciousness. Faith-based institutions represented a vulnerability that few Western counterintelligence officers had considered. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. Churches served as social centers for political elites. Cabinet members and senators attended regular services. Military officers brought families to worship. Intelligence officials sought spiritual guidance alongside their neighbors. These gatherings occurred weekly, creating predictable patterns. The social hour after services encouraged informal conversation. Church committees and volunteer work fostered deeper relationships. Wedding invitations and baptisms extended access into private family events. Yet security protocols treated religious spaces as inherently safe. Background checks for church volunteers were non-existent. Conversations in parish halls were assumed private. The shared experience of worship created automatic trust among congregation members. Soviet intelligence analysts had studied American religious participation patterns since the late 1940s. They understood that faith was central to American identity, particularly in contrast to Soviet atheism. This made religious institutions psychologically protected spaces in the American mind. The KGB issued a directive in 1956 identifying churches with politically significant congregations as priority infiltration targets. The directive specifically mentioned National Presbyterian Church, National Cathedral, and several prominent Catholic parishes in the Washington, D.C. area. Traditional cover identities, journalists, diplomats, trade representatives had become increasingly scrutinized as counterintelligence improved. The FBI maintained surveillance on Soviet embassy personnel. Diplomatic social events were understood to be intelligence battlegrounds. But church choirs represented something different entirely. Americans expected their churches to welcome strangers seeking faith. The Christian duty of acceptance created operational advantages that no diplomatic cover could match. Choir membership specifically offered unique benefits. Weekly rehearsals provided multiple access points beyond Sunday services. The intimate nature of making music together fostered genuine friendships. Choir members often socialized outside church, attending concerts and dinners, and together. The demographic composition of church choirs included professional people, teachers, government employees, military families. These were exactly the social circles that intelligence officers needed to penetrate to gather information about policy debates, personnel movements, and institutional tensions. Soviet training programs began developing operatives with musical ability specifically for church infiltration missions. Voice training became part of espionage preparation. Operatives studied Christian theology, memorized scripture, learned to perform religious devotion convincingly. The psychological advantage was profound. Americans struggled to reconcile the image of a devout choir member with that of a Soviet spy. The cognitive dissonance worked in the operatives' favor. Even when suspicious behavior might be noticed, the church context provided innocent explanations. Historical precedent existed. Nazi intelligence had successfully used church cover during World War II. Soviet intelligence studied these cases and refined the methodology. The key was patience. Infiltration required years, not months. The payoff came from sustained access to information over time. By 1958, the KGB had operatives in religious institutions across America and Western Europe. Some were priests and ministers, others were organists and music directors. Many, like the man now called Andrei Kashkin, were simply choir members who sang hymns while gathering intelligence that would flow back to Moscow Center. The Americans had no idea their churches had become battlegrounds. The man who called himself Andrei Kashkin had been born Anatoly Baranov in Leningrad in 1924. He survived the siege that killed his mother and two sisters. Hunger defined his childhood. Cold defined his adolescence. Loss defined his relationship with the West. His father had been a naval engineer executed in 1938 during Stalin's purges for alleged espionage. The accusation was false, but that meant nothing. Young Anatoly learned early that the state demanded absolute loyalty regardless of truth or justice. He joined the Red Army in 1942 at age 18. He survived the war fighting on the Eastern Front. He witnessed horrors that would stay with him forever. When victory came in 1945, He believed the sacrifice had meaning. The Soviet Union had defeated fascism. Now they would build paradise. After the war, Baranov studied engineering at Leningrad State University. His academic performance attracted attention from state security. In 1949, he was recruited into what would become the KGB. His father's execution, rather than disqualifying him, made him eager to prove his loyalty. He spent 3 years in basic intelligence training. He learned surveillance, photography, document analysis, and interrogation techniques. He mastered English and improved his German. He studied American culture, politics, and social customs until he could pass as someone who had lived there. But Baranov possessed an unusual skill that separated him from other recruits. He had sung in the Leningrad boys' choir before the war. His voice had survived the siege, the fighting, the years of hardship. When KGB instructors tested his tenor range, they recognized potential for a specific type of operation. In 1955, Baranov was transferred to Institute 311, a facility outside Moscow dedicated to deep cover training. There, operatives spent years preparing for long-term infiltration missions in the West. The training was comprehensive and brutal. Voice coaches worked with Baranov daily, refining his technique and expanding his repertoire. He learned sacred music from Catholic masses, Protestant hymns, and Orthodox liturgies. He could sing in Latin, German, and English with proper pronunciation and emotional authenticity. He also studied Christian theology intensively. He memorized large portions of the Bible. He learned the differences between denominations. He understood religious practices, rituals, and beliefs well enough to discuss them convincingly with actual believers. The psychological preparation was perhaps most challenging. Baranov was a committed communist and convinced atheist. Performing religious devotion required him to suppress his genuine contempt for what he considered superstition and oppression. But he learned to separate his true beliefs from his operational requirements. His legend, his false identity, was carefully constructed. Andrei Kashkin was born in Riga, Latvia, in 1926. His parents had been killed during Soviet occupation. He fled to West Germany in 1953, lived in a displaced persons camp for 2 years, then immigrated to Canada in 1956. The legend included verifiable details. Real documents were created in real archives. People who would confirm parts of his story were placed in position. His cover was designed to withstand investigation. In March 1957, Andrei Kashkin entered the United States through Detroit. He settled in Washington, D.C., found work at a Russian import company, and began the patient work of establishing himself as an ordinary immigrant pursuing the American dream while quietly searching for the perfect cover identity. When he learned about National Presbyterian Church's prominent congregation, he knew he had found it. National Presbyterian Church's Sunday services read like a directory of American Cold War power. The congregation included some of the most influential figures in Washington, people whose decisions shaped global policy and military strategy. Secretary of Defense Neil McElroy attended regularly with his family. He sat 3 rows from the front, always on the right side, arriving precisely 10 minutes before services began. McElroy oversaw the Pentagon during a period of massive nuclear buildup. The policies he implemented would define American military doctrine for decades. 2 rows behind McElroy sat Richard Bissell, CIA Deputy Director of Plans. Bissell controlled the agency's Covert Operations Division. He was currently overseeing U-2 spy plane missions over the Soviet Union and planning what would become the Bay of Pigs invasion. His presence at church was one of the few times he appeared in public without security. Colonel Thomas Palmer, stationed at the Pentagon, brought his wife and 3 children every Sunday. Palmer worked in strategic planning, coordinating military responses to potential Soviet aggression. He knew deployment schedules, weapons capabilities, and contingency plans for various conflict scenarios. State Department officials filled several pews. These were the diplomats and policy advisors who shaped America's approach to negotiations with Moscow. They understood Soviet intentions, analyzed Kremlin politics, and recommended courses of action to the president. The church attracted these powerful figures for several reasons. Its location on Connecticut Avenue was convenient to Georgetown and upper northwest Washington, where many of them lived. The pastor, Reverend James Matthews, was an eloquent preacher who addressed contemporary issues thoughtfully. The music program was exceptional, but perhaps most importantly, National Presbyterian offered a community of peers. These government officials spent their weeks dealing with classified information and immense pressure. Sunday services provided respite. The shared faith created bonds that transcended professional hierarchies. After services, the congregation gathered in the parish hall for coffee and fellowship. This social hour became the real center of church life. Conversations flowed freely. People discussed their week, their challenges, their concerns. Wives talked about family matters. Men debated policy questions they were grappling with at work. The atmosphere was relaxed and trusting. Church was a safe space where guards could be lowered. Nobody expected a Soviet intelligence officer to be pouring coffee and discussing hymn selections. Andrei Kashkin integrated himself into this community with patient skill. He volunteered for every activity. He helped set up chairs before services. He served on the music committee. He attended Wednesday evening Bible study groups. He became known as helpful, humble, and deeply devout. Other choir members enjoyed his company. He had interesting stories about his escape from Soviet control that made him sympathetic. His genuine enthusiasm for music made him popular with the other singers. Kashkin carefully built relationships with key congregation members. He would compliment Secretary McElroy's wife on her hat. He would ask Colonel Palmer about his son's baseball team. He would discuss theology with State Department officials during coffee hour. These relationships opened doors. Wedding invitations arrived. Kashkin was asked to join a men's prayer breakfast group that met Tuesday mornings. He was invited to dinner parties at people's homes. Each invitation provided opportunities. Casual conversations revealed information that would be valuable to Moscow. A mention of upcoming travel dates, a complaint about difficult negotiations, a discussion of budget priorities or personnel conflicts. Kashkin never asked direct questions. He simply listened carefully and remembered everything. His memory was exceptional, trained to retain details without notes. Later, alone in his apartment, he would transcribe conversations for his handler. The intelligence product was extraordinary. Moscow Center received regular reports about American defense policy discussions, CIA operational planning, and diplomatic strategy. The information came from casual conversations over coffee in a church basement, gathered by a man who sang Amazing Grace with apparent devotion. Every Thursday evening, Andrei Kashkin attended what appeared to be an adult education class in Russian language and literature at Georgetown University. He would arrive at 6:30 carrying a worn copy of Pushkin or Tolstoy and take his seat among other students interested in Slavic culture. The class was real. The instructor was a genuine Georgetown professor. The other students were authentic language enthusiasts. Everything appeared completely normal. But for Kashkin, the class served a different purpose. His handler, a Soviet embassy official who used the name Peter Volkov, attended the same class. Volkov's official title was cultural attaché. His actual role was KGB station chief for religious infiltration operations in the Washington area. The class provided perfect cover for regular contact. Two Russian speakers attending a Russian literature class attracted no suspicion. If FBI surveillance photographed them together, there was an innocent explanation. The university setting offered multiple opportunities for brief communication without obvious pattern. The tradecraft was sophisticated and disciplined. Kashkin and Volkov never acknowledged each other during class. They sat on opposite sides of the room. They never spoke directly. But during the break, when students stretched and chatted, they would execute brush passes, brief physical contact, during which materials were exchanged. Kashkin might leave a folded paper in a specific book on the shelf. Volkov would retrieve it minutes later while browsing. Or Volkov would place a small envelope behind a loose brick outside the building. Kashkin would collect it on his way home. The exchanges were invisible to observers who did not know what to look for. The dead drop locations throughout Washington were carefully selected. A hollowed-out brick in a wall along the C&O Canal. A magnetic container under a bench in DuPont Circle. A specific tree in Rock Creek Park with a cavity that could hold film canisters. Kashkin used a Minox camera to photograph documents he occasionally obtained. Church members sometimes left briefcases or folders unattended during social events. A quick trip to the bathroom with someone's briefcase, 2 minutes of rapid photography, and the material was documented without the owner ever knowing. But most of his intelligence came from conversations and observations. He had trained himself to remember complex discussions word for word. His reports to Moscow included detailed personality assessments of congregation members, their political views, their personal vulnerabilities, their daily routines. The reporting format was specific. Each contact was identified by a code number. Conversations were transcribed with date, location, and participants noted. Kashkin evaluated the reliability and significance of each piece of information. Moscow Center could then compare his reports with intelligence from other sources to build comprehensive pictures. Payment came through the Russian import company where Kashkin nominally worked. His salary was far higher than his modest lifestyle required. The excess funds were payment for his intelligence work. Additional cash came through dead drops when he needed operational expenses. The discipline required was immense. Kashkin maintained his cover every moment he was not alone in his apartment. He attended church twice weekly. He practiced with the choir. He participated in Bible studies. He built friendships. He performed devotion. On Sunday morning he sang hymns with genuine skill and apparent feeling. On Monday evening he sat in his apartment transcribing everything he had learned, encoding it for transmission to Volkov. On Tuesday he executed a dead drop, leaving his report in the hollow brick on the canal path. On Wednesday he attended Bible study and listened carefully to defense officials discuss their concerns about Soviet missile development. On Thursday, he attended Russian literature class and received new instructions from his handler. The cycle continued without break, week after week, month after month. The operation was productive beyond Moscow's expectations. On Sunday mornings, Andrei Kashkin sang Amazing Grace with apparent devotion, his tenor voice rising clearly above the congregation. On Monday evenings, he transcribed conversations for transmission to Moscow. The double life required constant psychological compartmentalization. The toll was significant, though he rarely acknowledged it even to himself. Deep cover operations demanded that operatives suppress their true identity for years at a time. They performed emotions they did not feel. They built relationships based entirely on deception. They violated the trust of people who considered them friends. Kashkin had been raised in Soviet atheism. He believed religion was, as Marx had written, the opium of the people. He considered Christianity a tool of oppression, a method by which capitalist systems kept workers passive and accepting of inequality. His contempt for religious faith was genuine and deeply held. Yet, every Sunday he knelt in prayer. He recited creeds he considered nonsense. He sang hymns praising a God he was certain did not exist. He discussed Scripture with conviction, analyzing passages he viewed as fairy tales. The performance was flawless but exhausting. His reputation in the church grew steadily. Congregation members saw him as devout, humble, and helpful. The music director relied on him to mentor new choir members. He was asked to serve on the church governing board. People invited him to their homes and introduced him to their families. These relationships created intelligence opportunities. A dinner invitation to the home of a State Department official provided access to a study where classified briefings sometimes sat on the desk. A conversation at a wedding reception revealed travel schedules of senior military officers. A casual complaint about workplace stress exposed internal debates about covert operations. Kashkin engineered conversations with subtle skill. He would mention reading something in the newspaper, then ask innocuous questions that encouraged people to share their expert knowledge. He expressed admiration for their work, making them feel appreciated and understood. He listened with flattering attention, encouraging them to talk more. The intelligence coups were significant. In November 1959, Kashkin learned from a casual coffee-hour conversation that the CIA was planning a major operation involving Cuban exiles. He did not obtain specific details, but the advance warning allowed Moscow to begin preparations for what would become the Bay of Pigs invasion. In March 1960, an Undersecretary of State mentioned at a church dinner that he would be traveling to Geneva for preliminary discussions about nuclear test ban negotiations. Kashkin reported the travel dates, the topics to be discussed, and the American negotiating position based on complaints the official made about his instructions from Washington. In July 1960, a Pentagon colonel discussed with Kashkin his frustrations about proposed defense budget cuts. The conversation revealed internal debates about weapons systems priorities and military readiness assessments that Moscow found valuable for their strategic planning. But the operation created complications beyond intelligence gathering. Kashkin had been instructed to remain socially isolated to minimize risks. He was to avoid romantic relationships and close personal friendships. Emotional attachments created vulnerabilities and complications. Yet in the choir, alto section, sat a woman named Margaret Donaldson. She was 32 years old, unmarried, working as a librarian at the Library of Congress. She had a gentle manner and a genuine warmth that made her popular in the congregation. Margaret began showing interest in Kashkin in the spring of 1960. She would sit near him during social hours. She asked about his background with compassionate attention. She invited him to a concert at the Kennedy Center. Kashkin recognized the danger immediately. Personal relationships threatened operational security. Emotional involvement created the risk of confession or mistakes. Moscow Center's standing order was clear regarding such situations. But something unexpected happened. Kashkin found himself genuinely drawn to Margaret. Her kindness seemed authentic. Her interest in him appeared real. For the first time in years of performance, he felt seen as a person rather than as a cover identity. The cognitive dissonance became severe. He was deceiving her fundamentally. Everything she knew about him was false, yet his feelings were becoming real. In February 1961, a KGB major named Anatoly Golitsyn walked into the CIA station in Helsinki and requested asylum. The defection sent immediate shockwaves through Soviet intelligence operations worldwide. Golitsyn brought with him years of knowledge about KGB methods, operations, and personnel. His information was both valuable and frustratingly vague. Golitsyn had worked in the Counterintelligence Directorate, analyzing foreign intelligence services. He knew about penetrations and operations in general terms, but he had not been given access to specific details about most active cases for security reasons. Among his warnings was a reference to KGB assets operating undercover in religious organizations in the Washington, D.C. area. He could not identify specific individuals or churches. He did not know operational details, but he confirmed that such infiltrations existed and were considered highly productive by Moscow Center. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover received this information with immediate interest. The Bureau had long focused on traditional espionage vectors, embassy personnel, journalists, trade delegations. The idea that Soviet intelligence might be using churches as operational cover had not received serious attention. Hoover assigned a counterintelligence team to investigate. The challenge was immense. Greater Washington contained hundreds of churches representing dozens of denominations. Thousands of people attended services weekly. Identifying a single Soviet operative in this landscape seemed nearly impossible. The FBI began by analyzing which churches would be most attractive for intelligence purposes. They identified institutions with politically significant congregations. National Presbyterian Church appeared high on the list, along with National Cathedral, several prominent Catholic parishes, and large churches in Arlington and Alexandria. Surveillance resources were limited. The FBI could not monitor every church simultaneously. They prioritized based on congregation demographics and proximity to government facilities. They also began watching known Soviet embassy personnel for any indication of religious activity. Peter Volkov, the cultural attaché, came under renewed scrutiny. The FBI had long suspected Volkov was an intelligence officer, but they had never caught him engaging in obvious operational behavior. His attendance at Georgetown University Russian literature classes was noted, but seemed to fit his cultural mission. Investigators began attending services at target churches. They photographed congregations. They collected church directories and membership lists. They cross-referenced names with government employee databases and security clearance records. The work was tedious and time-consuming. Counterintelligence operations required patience that sometimes tested agents' commitment. Weeks passed with no obvious leads. The team began to wonder whether Golitsyn's information was accurate or whether the operation had already been terminated after his defection. But the FBI persisted. They understood that Soviet deep cover operations were designed for the long term. An asset might have been in place for years. Identifying them would require equally patient investigation. In April 1961, surveillance teams began focusing specifically on National Presbyterian Church. The congregation included too many high-value targets to ignore. Secretary of Defense, CIA officials, Pentagon officers, State Department personnel, all worshiping together every Sunday. FBI agents started attending services. They took communion alongside the congregation they were investigating. They joined coffee hour and made pleasant conversation while memorizing faces and noting who spoke with whom. They volunteered for church activities to gain closer access. The investigation proceeded methodically through spring and summer of 1961. Agents compiled extensive files on church members, staff, and volunteers. Background checks were run on everyone with regular access to the facility. Immigration records were examined for anyone with Eastern European backgrounds. Andrei Kashkin's file received attention. His refugee story was checked against immigration records. His employment at the Russian import company was noted. His active participation in church life was documented. But nothing immediately raised red flags. His legend had been constructed carefully enough to withstand basic investigation. The breakthrough, when it came, would result from patient surveillance rather than database analysis. The FBI understood that identifying Soviet operatives required watching behavior over time, looking for patterns that revealed operational activity beneath the surface of normal life. They settled in for a long investigation, understanding that espionage was often a waiting game where victory came to whoever had more patience. FBI Special Agent Thomas Beckett had been assigned to what the Bureau called church surveillance. The task felt both absurd and potentially crucial. He attended services at National Presbyterian Church every Sunday, sitting in different pews, observing congregation members, taking mental notes. Beckett was 42 years old, a counterintelligence specialist, with 16 years' experience. He had worked Soviet cases throughout his career. He understood KGB methodology and operational patterns. He knew that successful espionage often relied on patience and the ability to recognize anomalies in seemingly normal behavior. His instructions were to integrate himself into church life while maintaining surveillance. He joined the congregation officially, registering as a new member. He attended coffee hour and introduced himself as a government lawyer, which was technically accurate. He volunteered to help with various church activities. The tedium was profound. Week after week, Beckett attended services, sang hymns, listened to sermons, and drank coffee while making small talk. He photographed other attendees discreetly. He noted who arrived together and who left together. He memorized the regular congregation members and watched for anyone new. He also attended services at several other target churches, rotating through them to maintain coverage. Sundays became entirely dedicated to surveillance operations disguised as religious devotion. Beckett's own faith had lapsed years ago, but he performed participation convincingly. The investigation expanded to include surveillance of Soviet embassy personnel. Peter Volkov, the cultural attaché, was followed regularly. FBI teams tracked his movements throughout Washington, documenting his routines and contacts. Volkov was professionally careful. He never performed obvious dead drops or suspicious meetings. He attended diplomatic functions, visited museums and galleries, and taught his Russian literature class at Georgetown. His behavior appeared exactly as a cultural officer's behavior should appear. But in September 1961, a surveillance team photographed Volkov at a bookstore on Wisconsin Avenue. He was browsing the foreign language section, which fit his profile, but the photograph captured something else in the background. Another man was also browsing the shelves, standing approximately 10 feet from Volkov. The angle of the photograph happened to catch both men in frame. The second man was reaching for a book on the same shelf Volkov had just walked away from. The surveillance team had not noticed the interaction in real time. It appeared to be two strangers coincidentally browsing the same section, but when analysts examined the photograph later, they recognized the possibility of a brush pass or dead drop signal. The second man in the photograph was identified through comparison with the church congregation photos Beckett had been taking. His name was Andrei Kashkin. He sang in the choir at National Presbyterian Church. This was not proof of anything. Two Russian speakers encountering each other in the foreign language section of a bookstore could be pure coincidence, but it was interesting enough to warrant deeper investigation. The FBI pulled Kashkin's file and examined it more carefully. His refugee story was rechecked. His employment records were analyzed. His immigration documents were sent to specialists who looked for indications of forgery or Soviet intelligence document production methods. Small inconsistencies began to emerge, dates that did not quite align, references that could not be fully verified, details that seemed too perfect. None of it was definitive, but collectively it suggested his background might be partially fabricated. Beckett was assigned to focus specifically on Kashkin. He began attending choir rehearsals as a prospective new member. He engaged Kashkin in conversations, probing his background story with careful questions. He watched how Kashkin interacted with other congregation members, looking for signs of intelligence collection behavior. The investigation intensified. Kashkin's apartment building was placed under surveillance. His phone was tapped, though he rarely used it. His mail was intercepted and examined before delivery. FBI teams followed him throughout Washington, documenting every movement. The Bureau faced a critical decision. They could arrest Kashkin based on suspicion and inconsistencies in his background. But without hard evidence of espionage, a prosecution might fail. More importantly, arresting him immediately might miss the opportunity to identify his complete network and understand the full scope of the operation. Hoover made the call. Continue surveillance. Build the case carefully. Let the operation continue under observation until they had everything they needed. For 8 months, FBI surveillance teams followed Andrei Kashkin through his carefully constructed life. They documented every contact, every movement, every potential intelligence transmission. The operation, codenamed Choir Master, became one of the Bureau's highest priority counterintelligence cases. Technical surveillance produced a detailed picture of Kashkin's daily routines. Phone taps revealed almost nothing. He rarely used his home phone, and never for sensitive conversations. But mail intercepts showed correspondence with the Russian import company that employed him, letters that sometimes contained subtle anomalies in phrasing that suggested coded communication. Physical surveillance teams tracked Kashkin's movements throughout Washington. He walked frequently, which made following him difficult in sparse pedestrian areas, but also created opportunities to observe his behavior. The teams documented his routes, timing, and any deviations from established patterns. In January 1962, surveillance observed Kashkin walking along the C&O Canal towpath, a route he took occasionally for exercise. He stopped briefly to tie his shoe near a specific section of wall. The movement seemed innocent, but the location was noted. 2 days later, Peter Volkov walked the same section of canal. He also paused at the same spot, apparently examining the historic stonework. The FBI teams recognized what they were witnessing. This was a dead drop location. Kashkin had deposited material. Volkov had retrieved it. Over subsequent weeks, agents identified 3 more dead drop sites. A bench in DuPont Circle where material could be hidden in a magnetic container underneath. A tree in Rock Creek Park with a cavity that held small packages. A loose brick behind the Georgetown University Library. The FBI now had proof that Kashkin was transmitting information to a known Soviet intelligence officer. But they still did not know exactly what intelligence he was providing or how he was obtaining it. They needed to understand the full scope of his access and identify any other assets in his network. FBI Director Hoover made the difficult decision to allow the operation to continue. American officials at National Presbyterian Church were informed that their conversations might be compromised, but they were told to act naturally to avoid alerting the Soviet operative. The controlled compromise was acceptable if it led to mapping the complete network. The investigation expanded to identify other potential church-based assets. FBI teams began monitoring churches in other cities, looking for similar patterns. Over several months, they identified suspicious individuals in religious institutions in New York, San Francisco, and Chicago. The church infiltration program appeared to be nationwide. During this period, Kashkin's intelligence gathering continued. The FBI watched as he attended church events, engaged congregation members in conversations, and transmitted information through the dead drop system. The damage was occurring in real time, but Hoover believed the long-term benefit of understanding Soviet methodology outweighed the short-term losses. In October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Kashkin's intelligence during this period became particularly valuable to Moscow. He reported on the mood among defense officials, internal debates about responses to Soviet missiles in Cuba, and discussions about military readiness. FBI surveillance documented him making 3 dead drops during the 13-day crisis. The material he transmitted included information obtained from conversations with Pentagon officers and CIA officials who attended National Presbyterian Church. Moscow Center was receiving near real-time intelligence about American decision-making at the highest levels. After the crisis resolved, Hoover ordered a comprehensive review of the case. The FBI had now documented Kashkin's espionage activities for over a year. They had identified his handler, his communication methods, and several other suspected assets in different cities. They had proof sufficient for prosecution. The decision was made to terminate the operation. The intelligence losses had become too significant. The FBI had learned what they needed to know about Soviet church infiltration methods. Now it was time to shut it down. The arrest was scheduled for late October 1963. On October 17, 1963, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover received authorization from Attorney General Robert Kennedy to terminate the Soviet espionage operation, codenamed Choir Master. The decision ended months of debate about timing and method. The planning was meticulous. Arrests would be coordinated to occur simultaneously, preventing any asset from warning others. Kashkin would be taken on a Thursday evening after his Georgetown University class. Peter Volkov would be declared persona non grata and expelled immediately. Other suspected assets in different cities would be arrested within hours. The operation required coordination between FBI field offices, the State Department, and CIA. Diplomatic implications had to be managed. Moscow would retaliate by expelling American diplomats or arresting CIA officers operating in Soviet territory. The State Department needed advance warning to prepare for these consequences. On Thursday evening, October 24th, Andrei Kashkin left his Russian literature class at Georgetown University at approximately 8:15. He walked down O Street toward Wisconsin Avenue, where he planned to catch a bus to his apartment. The evening was cool and clear. The street was quiet. 3 FBI agents approached from different directions, converging smoothly. They identified themselves and informed Kashkin he was under arrest for espionage. They asked him to place his hands behind his back. Kashkin's face showed no surprise, only resignation. He had been trained to recognize when an operation was compromised. The sudden appearance of multiple agents with perfect positioning indicated they had been watching him for some time. He offered no resistance. The arrest was professional and quick. Kashkin was handcuffed, placed in an unmarked car, and driven to FBI headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue. The entire interaction took less than 2 minutes. Witnesses on the street saw nothing unusual, just men in suits walking together. Simultaneously, FBI teams executed searches of Kashkin's apartment, his workplace, and the dead drop locations they had been monitoring. The apartment search revealed photography equipment, coding materials, and $15,000 in cash hidden behind a loose baseboard. They found detailed notes about conversations with church congregation members, though written in a code that would require time to break. They discovered a Minox camera with film still loaded. They recovered documents that appeared to be instructions from his handlers about information priorities. Peter Volkov was not arrested, as diplomatic immunity protected him from prosecution. Instead, State Department officials delivered a formal notification that he was persona non grata and had 48 hours to leave the United States. Volkov accepted the news without comment, packed his belongings, and departed on a Soviet diplomatic flight 2 days later. The Soviet embassy issued a statement denying any knowledge of intelligence operations and calling the expulsion a provocation designed to damage U.S.-Soviet relations. The response was expected and ignored. At FBI headquarters, Kashkin was processed and placed in a secure interrogation room. He was offered water and food, which he accepted. He was informed of his rights and provided access to legal counsel. He remained calm and professional throughout. The interrogation began that same evening. FBI counterintelligence specialists sat across from Kashkin and laid out what they knew. They showed him surveillance photographs documenting dead drops. They played recordings of his conversations with Peter Volkov captured through directional microphones. They displayed the evidence recovered from his apartment. Kashkin listened without reaction. When asked if he wished to make a statement, he declined. When asked if he would cooperate by identifying other Soviet assets, he refused. When offered the possibility of a reduced sentence in exchange for information, he showed no interest. His training had prepared him for this moment. He understood that admitting nothing, confirming nothing, and demanding nothing was his best strategy. He would allow his lawyer to handle legal proceedings. He would maintain silence about operational details. But one thing was clear to the FBI agents in the room. This was no amateur. Kashkin was a professional intelligence officer who had successfully operated under deep cover for over 5 years. His arrest marked the end of one operation, but raised troubling questions about how many others might still be running. The trial of Andrei Kashkin, whose real name the prosecution revealed as Anatoly Baranov, began in March 1964 in Federal District Court in Washington, D.C. The government had decided to prosecute rather than pursue a prisoner exchange, wanting to expose Soviet religious infiltration tactics publicly. The decision to go to trial was controversial within the intelligence community. CIA officials argued that a public trial would reveal counterintelligence methods and alert other Soviet assets that church operations had been compromised. The State Department worried about diplomatic fallout and Soviet retaliation, but the Justice Department prevailed. Attorney General Robert Kennedy believed the American public needed to understand that Soviet espionage was penetrating even religious institutions. The trial would serve as a warning and potentially prompt better security awareness nationwide. The evidence presented was extensive and damning. FBI agents testified about the surveillance operation, describing in detail how they had tracked Kashkin for months. Photographs showed him executing dead drops and meeting with Peter Volkov. Recovered materials from his apartment demonstrated his espionage activities. Congregation members from National Presbyterian Church testified about their interactions with Kashkin. The music director described hiring him. Choir. Members recalled his participation in church activities. Several government officials admitted they had discussed sensitive work matters with him during social hours. The most powerful testimony came from Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who confirmed that policy discussions occurring at church gatherings had later been referenced in Soviet diplomatic communications. The prosecution introduced classified intercepts showing that Moscow had received intelligence clearly sourced from National Presbyterian Church conversations. Kashkin's defense attorney argued that much of the evidence was circumstantial. The meetings with Volkov could be innocent interactions between Russian speakers. The cash in his apartment could be savings. The photography equipment could be a hobby. The coded notes could be personal diary entries. But the cumulative weight of evidence was overwhelming. The jury heard testimony about his fraudulent immigration documents. They learned his entire background story was fabricated. They saw proof that he had transmitted information to Soviet intelligence for years. Throughout the trial, Kashkin remained stoic and silent. He never took the stand in his own defense. He showed no emotion when witnesses described his betrayal of their trust. He offered no apology or explanation for his actions. The trial included several days of closed sessions where classified information was presented to the jury. These sessions addressed the specific intelligence Kashkin had transmitted and the damage assessment conducted by various agencies. The details remain classified to this day. On April 17, 1964, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts of espionage. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Kashkin's expression did not change. Sentencing occurred 2 weeks later. The judge, reviewing the scope of Kashkin's betrayal and the sensitivity of the intelligence he had compromised, imposed a sentence of 30 years in federal prison. The judge's statement emphasized the violation of religious sanctuary and the exploitation of Americans' faith for hostile intelligence purposes. Kashkin was remanded immediately to federal custody. He was transported to a maximum security facility where he would spend the next 2 decades. He never spoke publicly about his case. He never granted interviews. He maintained his silence completely. The impact on National Presbyterian Church was profound and lasting. The congregation experienced collective trauma from learning that their church had been used as an espionage platform. Trust among members was damaged. Government officials stopped discussing work matters at church events entirely. The church implemented new security procedures. Background checks became mandatory for all staff and volunteers. Visitors were tracked more carefully. The open, welcoming atmosphere that had characterized the community was diminished by necessary caution. Other churches nationwide responded similarly. Protestant denominations issued guidance about security awareness. Catholic dioceses implemented screening procedures. Jewish synagogues reviewed their membership processes. The innocence of religious spaces as protected sanctuaries was gone, replaced by vigilance and suspicion. The cultural shift was measurable. Churches serving government employees became more guarded. Faith communities that had prided themselves on welcoming strangers began asking questions. The Cold War had penetrated even the most intimate spaces of American spiritual life. Anatoly Baranov served 23 years of his sentence before being exchanged in a 1987 spy swap. He was traded for an American intelligence officer who had been captured in Moscow 3 years earlier. The exchange occurred on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, the traditional location for such Cold War transactions. Baranov returned to the Soviet Union as a hero within the intelligence community. He was awarded medals for his service, though the ceremonies were private and his role remained officially classified. The KGB provided him with a comfortable apartment in Moscow and a pension that reflected his years of dangerous work. In retirement, Baranov maintained the silence that had characterized his years in American prison. He declined interview requests from journalists and researchers. He avoided public attention entirely. His neighbors knew only that he was a retired government official, nothing more. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, some former KGB officers began speaking publicly about their careers. Baranov remained private, but he did grant one interview to a Russian newspaper in 1998. The interview was brief and revealed little operational detail, but it provided insight into his mindset. He defended his actions as patriotic duty. He expressed no regret for deceiving the church congregation. He claimed that faith itself was never insulted, only exploited for what he called a greater cause. He viewed his mission as defending the Soviet Union against American aggression during the Cold War. When asked about singing hymns while not believing in God, Baranov said that an intelligence officer must be capable of performing any role the mission requires. He compared it to an actor playing a part. The performance was separate from his true beliefs. He saw no moral contradiction. He died in 2003 at age 79 and was buried with military honors in a Moscow cemetery. His obituary in Russian newspapers identified him only as a veteran of the Great Patriotic War and a retired civil servant. His intelligence career remained officially secret even after his death. In Washington, D.C., National Presbyterian Church continued its ministry with lasting changes. The security protocols implemented after Baranov's exposure remained in place. Background checks for volunteers became standard practice. The congregation never returned to the open, trusting atmosphere that had existed before 1963. The FBI's investigation revealed that church infiltration had been more extensive than initially believed. Over several years following Baranov's arrest, the Bureau identified an estimated 12 to 15 other Soviet assets operating in religious institutions across America. Some were priests and ministers, others were church staff or active volunteers. Each discovery reinforced the lesson that Soviet intelligence had systematically targeted faith communities. The operations had been coordinated from Moscow Center and implemented with patience and professionalism. The intelligence gathered had shaped Soviet policy decisions throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s. The long-term damage to religious institutions was difficult to quantify. Many government officials stopped attending church entirely, worried that any public worship made them vulnerable to surveillance. Others continued attending but refused to participate in social activities or discussions. The chilling effect on religious community was real and lasting. Some churches struggled with the theological questions raised by Baranov's operation. Had they been complicit through naivete? Did their duty to welcome strangers conflict with responsibility for security? Should faith communities implement screening that seemed contrary to Christian principles of acceptance? These debates continued for years. Different denominations reached different conclusions, but the innocence was gone. Religious leaders could no longer assume that everyone seeking spiritual community had pure motives. The possibility of exploitation now shadowed every interaction. Thomas Becket, the FBI agent who had pursued the investigation, later became an instructor at the FBI Academy. He taught counterintelligence courses where Baranov's case became a primary example. Becket emphasized that successful espionage often exploited the target's best qualities, their trust, their faith, their desire to help others. Margaret Donaldson, the choir alto who had developed feelings for Kashkin, never married. She left National Presbyterian Church shortly after his arrest and never returned. Friends said the betrayal had been too profound. She had believed she was building a relationship with a genuine person. Learning his entire identity was false destroyed her ability to trust. The music director, Harold Morrison, retired in 1966, 3 years after the arrest. He carried guilt for bringing Baranov into the congregation. Though no one blamed him publicly, he blamed himself privately. More than 6 decades after Anatoly Baranov walked into National Presbyterian Church with a false name and a trained voice, the story continues to resonate. It stands as a powerful reminder that Cold War espionage penetrated every corner of American life, including spaces Americans considered sacred and inviolable. The operation demonstrated the sophistication of Soviet intelligence planning. Identifying religious institutions as security blind spots required careful analysis of American culture and psychology. Developing operatives with musical ability and theological knowledge required years of preparation. Maintaining deep cover in faith communities required discipline and skill. The success of Baranov's mission lay not in any single intelligence breakthrough, but in years of sustained access to high-value targets. He attended services beside people who shaped American defense policy. He sang hymns with officials who planned covert operations. He discussed scripture with diplomats who negotiated with Moscow. The conversations he overheard and participated in provided Moscow Center with invaluable context about American strategic thinking. They learned not just about specific policies, but about the underlying fears, assumptions, and constraints that shaped American decisions. This contextual intelligence was sometimes more valuable than operational details. The case also revealed vulnerabilities in American counterintelligence. The FBI had focused heavily on traditional espionage vectors while missing the exploitation of religious institutions. The assumption that faith communities were safe spaces created operational opportunities for Soviet intelligence. Americans' reluctance to suspect the devout worked perfectly in the adversary's favor. After Baranov's exposure, the FBI established what became known as the Church Infiltration Prevention Program. The program ran from 1964 until the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. It involved monitoring religious institutions that served significant government populations and providing security awareness training to religious leaders. The program was controversial. Civil liberties advocates argued it violated the separation of church and state and infringed on religious freedom. Religious leaders themselves were divided. Some appreciated the security assistance. Others resented government surveillance of their congregations. But the program did identify and prevent several subsequent infiltration attempts. The increased awareness among church communities made Soviet operations more difficult. Religious institutions began implementing background checks and security protocols that closed some of the vulnerabilities Baranov had exploited. Post-Soviet revelations from opened KGB archives confirmed the operation's success from Moscow's perspective. Documents showed that Baranov's intelligence had influenced Soviet policy decisions during critical Cold War moments. His reports were distributed to senior leadership and informed their understanding of American intentions. The archives also revealed that the church infiltration program continued well into the 1980s. The KGB maintained assets in religious institutions in multiple countries. The methodology Baranov had helped prove was replicated in Western Europe, Canada, and other locations where religious communities attracted political elites. Modern counterintelligence agencies still monitor religious institutions, though the threat has evolved. The concern now includes potential terrorist infiltration and foreign intelligence services from various nations. The basic vulnerability remains the same. Communities built on trust and openness can be exploited by those with hostile intent. National Presbyterian Church today continues to serve Washington's political community. Security measures are in place, but not obtrusive. Background checks are conducted. Visitors are welcomed but noticed. The congregation has learned to balance openness with awareness. The choir still sings every Sunday. The music program remains strong. But the members know their history. They understand that their church was once the site of a sophisticated espionage operation. That knowledge shapes their awareness without destroying their faith. In the end, Baranov's operation succeeded because it exploited trust itself. He used Americans' faith as a weapon against them. He violated the sanctuary of religious community for intelligence advantage. He proved that in the world of Cold War espionage, nothing was truly sacred. No space was safe. No relationship was immune to manipulation. The lesson endures. The most dangerous infiltrations are those that exploit our best qualities: trust, faith, the desire to welcome strangers, and the belief in shared values. These become vulnerabilities when adversaries understand how to weaponize them. The question that haunted investigators then and troubles security professionals now remains unanswered. How many operations like Baranov's succeeded completely? How many Soviet assets infiltrated churches, sang hymns, built relationships, and gathered intelligence without ever being caught? The silence from those who were never discovered is itself an answer.